I didn't necessarily know how or why or how I would get famous, but I wanted to be either a famous writer or an actress or a model. It was really just, I wanted to be famous. And I made my first attempt in 6th grade when I ran for vice president of my 6th grade class. And my dad actually wrote me a speech, a rap speech to the tune of Ice Ice Baby. And I got up there and I was like way less popular than the girl I was running against, so I did not succeed at this campaign at all. But a couple years later in 8th grade, I was in the auditorium and there were these two boys sitting behind me snickering and laughing and talking about that Ice Ice Baby speech, and I was like, oh, I guess people remember me. I guess I got a little bit famous for that speech, even though they're making fun of me and laughing at me. And I was never good at music or singing, but I did start to actually write some songs in my early 20s, and it was more like I was writing songs like a writer than like a musician. But I decided to try performing these songs at open mics, and even though like my singing voice is just really not like the kind of singing voice where you should do something like that apparently, and people were kind of laughing at me, but I was still like, I felt like I had written these songs and I just wanted to put them out there. It was like I was having my second childhood and I wanted to free my creative spirit. So one of my friends, though, was hosting an event, and I had done a lot of poetry in the past, but he knew that I was on this new wave of singing my songs and that they weren't really going over very well. So he called me and he said, hi, for this event, I'd like you to stick with poetry. And like my heart sank, and I never sang my songs again in front of anyone. But backward a couple years is when I was 21 and 22, I was very sick. I had been put on 7 different psychiatric pharmaceuticals, and I was bedridden for about 2 years. When I was coming out of that time, I went to this support group, and I met a man who was like immediately pursuing me, and he said, I know you were in my past lives. And we had this like spiritual connection and fell in love, and his name was David Bowie. But I didn't really think too much of it because it didn't have a W, it was just B-O-I-E. So I wasn't thinking like his name was David Bowie. But then, when I was 29, and I had just moved to San Francisco, so a friend of mine, so when I was on the East Coast, a friend of mine had tried to set me up with a friend of hers, and she suggested us to be Facebook friends, but like we never really became Facebook friends. But then when I was living in San Francisco when I was 29, I just moved there, and I was sick, and I was kind of just wasting time on Facebook because I was sick and just looking around. And I saw that guy that my friend had tried to set me up with on the East Coast was now living in San Francisco, like 2 neighborhoods away from me. So I was living in the inner Sunset, he was living in the outer Sunset, 2 blocks from the beach. And so we ended up meeting up, and like, the next thing I know, we're on the beach and we're kissing and we're dating, and like, we don't really have very much connection, but just like a lot in common because we're the same age and we both just moved to San Francisco and we're kind of lonely. And his name is Jim Morrison. This gets worse. Okay. So a couple years later, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I connect with this group of people that does this type of yoga called kaleidoscope yoga, where we hold hands and we make like these cool shapes with our bodies. And we would do it in this park, Colonel Summers Park, where a lot of people would just kind of roam around and connect, like try some, it's like we were doing our yoga and people would just come through and join in. So we're doing it, and this guy comes and stands next to me and holds my hand because we're all holding hands. And right away I was like, who is this person? He's gorgeous. He has like thick wavy hair. You can tell he works out a lot. And I also I feel his heart, and I'm like, I need to know this person. Like, I can really feel his spirit, and there's something about him that compels me. So we do this activity where everybody's supposed to say their name backwards, and he says his name is Naslu, and mine is Ayak. So we're doing this thing, and then, he leaves, everybody disperses, and I was like, okay, so his name is Wilson. And I go home and I try to find him on Facebook, and you wouldn't think that I would even find him because Wilson's like a popular last name. Portland's a fairly big city, but he comes up immediately. And I befriended him on Facebook. And he writes to me right away and says, did I meet you at a kava bar last summer? And I was like, I wasn't even in Portland last summer, but we meet up and we start dating right away, and his name is Wilson Phillips. And I was like, did your parents name you that on purpose? He's like, no, I was born in 1977, and he's like pissed off that I'm even asking him this question. Meanwhile, Jim Morrison, when I had asked him about why his parents named him that, he said that his parents didn't think that Jim Morrison would stay famous for very long. So anyways, basically David Bowie and Jim Morrison were not like rock star types at all. They were both fairly introverted and kind of loner types, and not the type of person you see getting up on stage or anything. But Wilson Phillips was a math teacher, and he was like kind of like a math teacher rock star. He used math as a way to like kind of be theatrical, and sometimes when the students were having trouble with the math, he would tell them to hold on, just hold on for one more day. And so at this time, so I should say that when I first started dating David Bowie, it was like I was coming out of this difficult time in my life, and I was starting to do a lot of public speaking. I was self-publishing my writing, and I was like putting myself out there publicly. And it was like the start of my career. And then at the time when I was dating Wilson Phillips, I had moved to Portland, and I was actually working as a sort of assistant for this man who was kind of a rock star in the movement to support people who are seeking to come off psychiatric meds, which was the realm that I was working in. And he had published a manual. He was famous worldwide. He would give talks at conferences all around the world. He was definitely like, I even called him like my rock star at times. And I was working for him, and my job was basically to like do what he told me to do, but he was traveling a lot, so a lot of times I could do whatever I wanted, but I got to a point where like I didn't want to be in that subordinate role anymore, and I really wanted to do my own thing, so I quit that job right at the same time that like my relationship with Wilson Phillips was ending, and I started my own consulting business. I started doing a ton of blogging, and I was in a film. And like a few years later, I wrote a book called Freedom from Psychiatric Drugs. And, but after this whole thing with these three rock star names, I was kind of like, what is that about? I mean, yeah, like it makes a funny story, but I was like, why did that happen? You know, like what is the universe trying to tell me here? There must be some reason. It's not like I'm seeking out these rock star named people or anything. But so I was actually telling this story a few weeks ago to some of my storytelling friends over here. And then the next day, I did a book talk down in Connecticut, and this guy came up to me and he was like, "Hiya Grossberg, you're one of the famous people in this movement." And he was kind of treating me like a celebrity. And I realized that even though, like, it's funny, it's like the things we get hyped up about as children, like being famous, it was like, I was finding my own form of that, and like that my way of putting myself out there publicly with my authentic voice was my purpose in life.